Hello and welcome to Lux's webinar, Avoiding Extinction in an Era of Shared Mobility. My name is Andrew Stockwell. I lead Lux's global research, consulting, product, and marketing teams, and I'll be your host today. Our speaker today is Chris Robinson, Senior Analyst and leader of Lux's Mobility Insights. If you have any questions for Chris during the webinar, please enter them into the Q&A box that you see on your screen. If you have any questions about Lux, you can always email them to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will follow up with you directly after the webinar. Before we do get started, a few words about the challenges we are seeing in mobility today and how Lux is helping companies like yours innovate smarter and grow faster. We primarily see and cover four major themes in our mobility research, as you see on the screen. The first is accessing and procuring mobility, where we cover on shared mobility in the form of ride-hailing, car sharing, or multimodal services that are disrupting conventional ownership structures and the way we interact with mobility. And this will in fact be the area that we focus on primarily during today's webinar. The second is increasing autonomy and connectivity, where connected and autonomous vehicles can enable more efficient traffic management and improve safety while also adding convenience for passengers. The third is around powering mobility, where regulatory and societal pressures are both putting pressure on all forms of mobility to reduce emissions and increase sustainability, leading to innovative powertrain designs to improve or replace combustion or fossil fuels. And the final is around evolving vehicle design, where we're investigating new materials that enable lighter weight and safer vehicle construction, while many digital technologies in the form of displays and personal assistants are also altering the user experience. So as a demonstration of our approach, I want to pass things off to Chris, who is going to take us in this webinar through a brief discussion on the current state of innovation in mobility, a framework for how to think about companies and business models and shared mobility services, and then he will conclude with some discussion of key winning strategies in the shared mobility space. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Of course, there are a lot of really fascinating technologies when we look at the future of mobility more broadly, but today we want to focus on the business models and specifically shared mobility. I'm willing to bet whether it's around the water cooler in the boardroom that the topic of how companies like Uber and Lyft are going to impact your business in the future has come up. And that makes a lot of sense given Uber and Lyft's IPOs now see them valued higher than the incumbent big three automakers in the United States. So the big question everyone should be asking themselves is, do you feel confident that you've identified all the business opportunities and all the risks to your core business in this future of shared mobility? So today we want to walk through three sections. First, give a landscape of what does innovation in mobility today really mean? The second, shared mobility services is a broad category, so we want to share a taxonomy and framework to help you analyze the types of different services and business models out there. And then lastly, finish up with winning strategies in shared mobility. Provide a few case studies on companies that we think are doing interesting work in this space. But of course, starting with innovation in mobility, and when we talk about innovation in mobility today, really we're talking about cars. The reality is, whether we're talking about the developed world or the developing world, cars are a primary mode of transportation for much of the world. And this reliance on the car has resulted in a $1 trillion industry, whether we're talking about the sales of passenger vehicles or commercial vehicles. And similarly, with this large revenues, when we look at the companies around the world that spend the most amount of money in R&D globally, we can see that 6 of those companies are car manufacturers themselves, led by companies like Volkswagen and Toyota. But interestingly, if we look elsewhere, the top 6 companies that aren't car companies are still developing products for the car, whether it be software, companies like Amazon building connected car platforms, or companies like Intel buying companies like Mobileye to build the hardware for vehicles in the future. But another interesting story is what has changed in terms of how companies spend money on R&D in the past compared to today. So if we first look back at automotive innovation 40 years ago in the late 70s, We looked at Volkswagen, who puts all of their annual reports online in a searchable format, and looked for all of the topics and themes related to innovation or research and development. And some key themes emerged that were really focused on making cars cheaper and making cars better. So these included automating production facilities, digital design tools, so incorporating things like finite element analysis or computer-aided design in the vehicle design process, as well as designing cars to be more fuel efficient. We were coming out of an oil crisis in the mid-70s, so there was an increasing focus on using less gasoline. Now, we would broadly categorize these topics as a form of operational innovation, which is what Lux defines as the necessary type of innovation that companies must provide and explore, that is really focused on maintaining market share and keeping your core product competitive. But what we see in 2019 is themes that are very different. For the first time in a century, car companies are looking at changing what moves the wheels inside of a vehicle through looking at new battery technologies and fuel cell powertrains to provide zero-emission vehicles. We're also looking at fundamentally changing the way vehicles operate. With autonomous vehicles, we can open up new use cases, new businesses built around vehicles that can drive themselves. And these types of innovation are mostly what we call expansive innovation. These are focused on creating new opportunities for companies. And for car companies, this is really pushing them outside of their comfort zone, working on development of technologies that aren't necessarily something that they've been focused on in the past. Now, when we look at the underlying technologies required for this future, there's a lot of activity going on within car companies, but also outside of car companies. So every year at Lux, the Analyst team goes through an exercise where we try and identify the top technologies that are poised to change the world in the next decade. And we create this list by looking at several data points, things like patent filings, academic papers, startup funding, as well as how quickly those metrics are changing. So maybe there was a drastic increase in one of those. And what we find is of the 19 technologies we identified this year, 8 of them are related to the 4 themes that we mentioned in a very direct way. Things like machine learning and AI are really the core focus of self-driving cars and what's really powering development in that space. Things like battery fast charging and solid state batteries are trying to solve key pain points with electric powertrains related to range anxiety or batteries that might not charge fast enough. Now, we can spend, and we do spend a lot of time at Lux digging very deep into these technologies. But today I want to take a bit of a different approach. And that is because these new technologies are enabling disruption, but the business models that we wrap around these new technologies are just as, if not more important, and more disruptive towards the way we move. And to give an example of that, I will start with actually the invention of the car and moving back toward the late 1800s when we first saw the vehicle enter mass production, which we would define here as the Benz Velo, which made more than 130 units in 1895. Now, this vehicle was very expensive, intended for kind of an elite, wealthy customer. But it was just 2 years later that we saw the first taxi services emerge, where to access the benefits of a car, you didn't necessarily need to own it. We could kind of share the cost of vehicle ownership by paying per ride with a taxi. And similarly, we also saw the emergence of car rental companies. These companies would own fleets of vehicles and allow you to actually rent and drive the cars. And to highlight the importance of business models, yes, things like the assembly line made the technology much more affordable. But the business models really helped drive down the cost of mobility, making it from something of tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars in 2019 money to buy a vehicle in 1895 to being able to drive vehicles for just 30 cents a mile in 2019 dollars in 1912. So today we want to talk about the business models that we wrap around these new technologies. And today I think really the business models that we need to talk about are shared mobility services. Now, shared mobility is a pretty broad term encompassing a lot of different companies and technologies. So we first want to develop a taxonomy for what types of shared mobility services exist. And to do this, we ask ourselves 2 questions. The first question we ask ourselves is, who owns the asset being shared? This allows us to differentiate between some of the emerging peer-to-peer platforms where companies develop a platform without necessarily owning the vehicles on that network versus asset ownership. Maybe a more conventional type of rental company where they own a fleet of vehicles and rent them out to individuals. The other question we ask ourselves is, what is the user or consumer of mobility responsible for in this business model? Are they expected to actually navigate the vehicle or operate the vehicle and navigate from point A to point B? Or are they simply going to be a passenger in the vehicle taken from point A to point B? And so in taking a closer look at the space, we relied heavily on our data science team, asking them to go out and scrape the web for any evidence of startup activity, whether it be funding announcements or et cetera. And when we first entered the space, we thought maybe they might come back with a list of 50 to 100 companies. What they actually came back with was a list of 300 to 400 companies active in the space. So there's clearly a lot of activity in the space. And for Lux clients, they do have access to all of the information about those 300 or so companies that we have found. But we can now populate this quadrant with different business models. And of course, if we start in the bottom right quadrant, ride hailing is the most common service when we think of shared mobility, which is essentially like a taxi service, but accessed through a mobile device. Moving left on the quadrant, we can see peer-to-peer sharing networks, which is really kind of at the core of the broader term sharing economy, where maybe as private vehicle owners, we can make that available to other consumers via these platforms. So when individuals rent cars, they're not renting from a company, but from an individual. Moving upwards on this framework, we have the space of vehicle rentals, which is one of the more conventional types of companies. I mentioned the first car rental companies emerged in 1912. But what we've seen is a lot of these vehicle rental companies in recent years focused on smaller modes of transportation, things like bikes and scooters that are dockless and accessible solely through mobile devices. And then even within the automotive space, we have emerging cars as subscription platforms, companies like Canoe and Steer, which offer alternatives to owning a car that don't involve conventional purchasing or leasing models. And then lastly, we have probably the oldest business model within shared mobility, and that is transit operators. This is a case where maybe a mode of mobility is very expensive or inconvenient for individuals to own. So airline operators or train operators certainly fit this description. But we have seen startup activity in the space in the form of microtransit services. So the three companies here, Bridge, Trade, and Via, are all focused on deploying shuttles that are dynamically routed based on demand. Now, of course, when we have several hundred companies in the space, it's natural that the next question is, which one of these companies is most likely to succeed? And when we start answering questions about what types of mobility consumers prefer, that's a really complex question to answer. Of course, we have to take into consideration things like convenience, speed to get from point A to point B. But the one factor we wanted to model was costs. So among these different business model and modes, how much does each one cost to get from point A to point B? So we analyzed real-world data from two cities, New York City and Paris, to try and answer this question, and grab this data from existing services that operate in the city. So when we first looked at New York City in gridlock traffic conditions where it might take a long time to drive from point A to point B in traffic, we can make a few conclusions. One is that ride-hailing is very expensive. This is one city in the world where it's actually more expensive than taxis because of a strong taxi lobby. But even other forms of shared mobility like car sharing are still relatively expensive compared to other modes. The cheapest mode, particularly because of the gridlock traffic conditions, are different forms of micro-mobility. So bike and scooter sharing networks where you pay a relatively low fee, usually for a block of time like 30 minutes to rent a vehicle, but also you're not encumbered by traffic. Now, if we contrast that with a light traffic condition, we can see a couple of conclusions. One being that ride-hailing services are actually more affordable, less than $10 for a trip. And overall, between these different modes, there's significantly less spread between these different types of services. So here we can surmise that cost is probably not the dominant factor on many consumers' minds. they're probably thinking more about things like convenience and speed to get from point A to point B. But we can also look at different cities and see different results. So if we look at Paris in the same gridlock traffic conditions, ride-hailing is actually a very affordable option, particularly if you need to go less than half a kilometer. It's very competitive. The other thing we can see is that car sharing is very affordable. There is one of the largest and oldest operating car sharing fleets in Paris today, which makes getting around the city very affordable, and that this particular service is very affordable. Now, the conclusion that we drew when we looked at these scenarios and the others that we modeled is that within shared mobility, there's no killer app. There's no one mode of mobility or business model that's going to be the most affordable in any scenario. And we think this strengthens the argument that in the future, shared mobility needs to be multimodal, that you need to be able to incorporate all of these different modes like bikes and scooters and cars, as well as public transit into a platform to be successful. But when we think about this future, I think we also need to come back to some really key questions, because for the last century, car companies have dominated mobility. But if we see a rise in these shared mobility services, what is going to be the role of car companies? And are there other industries that can start to dethrone automakers as really being mobility providers in the future? So I'm going to wrap up today by walking through a few examples of this, walking through a few examples of companies that are building this multimodal future. And when we think about shared mobilities, I think we should first talk about automakers, because particularly in the last 12 months, automakers have been very focused on developing shared mobility solutions. Some automakers are doing this through acquisitions. So Ford acquired Spin for around $100 million, but is also committed toward investing a total of $300 million in growing that scooter sharing service. Others like BMW and Daimler are actually merging their services. When we look at shared mobility, competition is very intense, and the cost of competition is very expensive, which has really put pressure on the finances for ride-hailing companies. So BMW joining forces to combine services helps keep their customer acquisition costs low by growing their user base overnight, but also offering a more robust portfolio of services. And lastly, automakers are also exploring some new partners, like SoftBank and their Vision Fund have invested heavily in ride-hailing and autonomy. And Toyota is working with them to launch Monet, a mobility services company in Japan. Now, we could go into a lot more detail about what automakers are doing, but the case studies I want to focus on is what the competition is doing. So first, I want to focus on transportation network companies. And the most obvious example that most people think about is Uber, which was the first ride-hailing company founded about a decade ago. And they're also active in all of these quadrants and made aggressive expansions in 2018. Of course, they started as a ride-hailing company and have innovated within that space, adding services like premium services or SUVs or shared ride-hailing services. But this year focused specifically on adding bikes and scooters to their network through partnerships with Lime and eventually the acquisition of Jump. They've also explored peer-to-peer sharing networks through a partnership with GetAround, which, although it wasn't successful, they actually terminated that pilot just 6 months after beginning it. Uber did note they're still exploring how to offer car rentals to consumers on this platform. And if we look even farther in the future, programs like Uber Elevate and Uber ATG, their self-driving vehicle company, Uber seems to be positioning itself as a transit operator, owning a fleet of vehicles and providing rides to individuals. But some of their most interesting work and some of their key strategic moves haven't necessarily been in any of these quadrants. It's their push to offer public transit solutions, not just routing, but ticketing solutions in its app, which is helping them build that mobility as a service platform where they're a one-stop shop for mobility. And they're first doing this in Denver. And the story actually starts not with Uber, but with their public transit agency, RTD. RTD has been suffering from decreasing public ridership in Denver, which is a heavily car-focused city for mobility. And so explored a partnership with Masabi in 2017 to create a mobile platform for payments and ticketing, hoping to encourage more users to adopt public transit. Now, separately, Uber, somewhat under the radar, formed a partnership with Masabi, this mobile ticket and payment platform company, in 2018 explicitly to explore opportunities within public transit. And unsurprisingly, in 2019, formed a partnership directly with RTD, which would be the first example of integrating public transit, not only routing, but also ticketing and payments into the Uber platform. And this is really important. It seems counterintuitive because for the last decade, we've heard Uber and public transit agencies view themselves as competitors, and now they're partnered to work together. And some of their comments offer some insight into why. For RTD, they're still struggling with decreasing ridership. They see accessing Uber's platform as a way to bring more riders in that might recognize that sometimes they can get from point A to point B faster or more affordably than taking a car. And for Uber, they view this as really the next step in becoming the urban mobility platform and helping them access the 4.5 trillion public transportation miles traveled each year. So outside of public transportation network companies, it's also worth looking at this nebulous category of tech companies, companies like the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Alibabas of the world. And I want to focus specifically on Alphabet, because I think they have one of the most interesting plays in this multimodal mobility as a service future. Now, like any of the major tech companies, they have made pretty significant investments into the shared mobility space. Through their various investment arms, they've invested about $2 billion in the ride-hailing giants Gojek, Lyft, and Uber. They've also led investment rounds in companies like Lime in their $335 million round this year, and are focused on bike and scooter sharing networks. And they've been less active in the other quadrants, so they have minority stakes in companies like Turo, the first unicorn within the peer-to-peer sharing space, and have explored how cities should be working with transit agencies in cities of the future through organizations like Sidewalk Labs. But ultimately, I think the most important asset they have is leveraging Google Maps. When we think about mobility as a service and a solution that gets you from point A to point B, most of us already use the service like Google Maps to provide this functionality. They already provide walking directions and public transit directions, and are increasingly adding things like micromobility and ride-hailing services through their platform. But I think lastly, it's important to note, why would a tech company be focused on mobility as a service? Well, a lot of their revenues come from advertising. From a company like Google, it's over 80%. And part of their advertising revenue comes from working with local businesses like gas stations or restaurants to where they might pay to promote their business higher up on the Google Maps platform. So if more users are using this platform on a daily basis, it increases the value of their core revenue stream as well. So when we take a step back and think about what types of industries might own this future, I don't think the answer is a single industry. Of all the examples we've gone through, and we've just shared a couple today, there are good and bad examples of companies in each industry that are building the pieces of shared mobility. So I think when we look beyond the requirement of building that multimodal future, the next forefront is going to be the ability to incorporate autonomy and electrification in shared mobility, which will ultimately determine success of the space. So how can you capitalize on some of the opportunities in shared mobility? The first is building a multimodal toolbox. As we've mentioned, the most cost-effective way to get from point A to point B might be a different mode based on the time of day and the city you're in. And pairing that with the right analytical tools to help you enter a market and determine what's the right mix of modes and business models in this space is going to be crucial. The second is, as we think about introducing autonomy into these services, these vehicles are going to be used more frequently, a higher utilization rate, and probably for a longer amount of time, much longer than just the 200 to 250,000 miles that we see today. When we talk to companies like Waymo, they're trying to push this to 1 million miles. This means more frequent maintenance, but also impacts vehicle design, maybe needing things like more durable textiles or plastic finishes, so these vehicles don't age as quickly. And lastly, solving the environmental problem. And this is one of the biggest problems shared mobility faces. There is a mounting body of evidence that ride-hailing adds congestion and pollution in cities. And cities are going to put ride-hailing companies and shared mobility companies under intense pressure to reduce both. So with that, we'd like to open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. Tremendous presentation, very, very informative. And yes, we do have time for a couple of questions from the audience that have come through during the course of the webinar. A reminder that if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A box on your screen. So first question that came through here, Chris, you provided an example of Google Maps earlier towards the end of the presentation, which is already integrating these services without necessarily owning them. How important do you think it is that to own these assets versus operating a platform that aggregates them?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, especially with the popularity of Google Maps. I think ultimately not owning these services presents a bit of a risk. It's worth noting that yes, Uber is integrated into Google Maps. It used to be that you could book directly through the Google Maps application, but Uber then said, actually, we want you to have to book through the Uber app. So essentially, if there comes a point in time when Uber doesn't want to work with Google Maps, they can pull that service from Google Maps. So there's a bit of risk if you don't want to actually own those services. You're banking on your platform being valuable. The other aspect that's worth noting is Google is pursuing ownership of these services through companies like Waymo, which is very clearly trying to be an autonomous ride-hailing service. So ultimately, we do think, although these aggregating services are popular, certainly in China, we've seen ride-hailing aggregators with different companies on that platform become popular. Ultimately, owning your service is going to be a requirement in the future.
Okay, thanks. Time for one more question here. So another one that came through, you mentioned that autonomy is seen as crucial to the future of shared mobility. And all of the companies mentioned today during the webinar have autonomous vehicle development programs in place. So do you, Chris, see anyone as leaders in autonomy, both developing the technology and applying it to shared mobility?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, especially because, as I mentioned, we view autonomy as going to be increasingly important in the future. Ride-hailing companies aren't profitable today, but also spend about 80% of their gross bookings on paying drivers. So eliminating the driver is incredibly important. I think one of the crucial aspects when we look at leaders is a combination of the strength of your autonomy division paired with the right business models. And we look at someone like Waymo as having a distinct advantage in the space. Not only have they been operating in the space for a long period of time, essentially launching their autonomy program after the DARPA Grand Challenge, which really launched the last decade of interest in autonomous vehicles, but also have a lot of miles traveled and a strong development team. Outside of that, I think we'd have to look towards services. We can't ignore the role that China is playing in autonomous vehicle development. And Baidu's Apollo program is probably the best example of a really strong network of partnerships that could commercialize the technology.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for your answers to those questions, Chris. That's all the time we have. As a reminder, if you have any questions after this webinar about the content or Lux, please email us directly at questions@luxresearchinc.com. Someone will be sure to get back to you. You can also, of course, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, or follow our blog at luxresearchinc.com for ongoing information and insights. Thank you all very much for your attention. Thanks again to our presenter, Chris, and have a great day, everyone.